conference I had to attend. Most of you have sent in your extra credit / attendance verification emails to me. I think I have about 3 or 4 of you yet that haven't done that. If you want to earn those points for exam number 2, make sure that you get those submitted to me so that I can award you the points. We will have 2 extra credit questions today as we finish this chapter on the cardiovascular system. And this is our second out of 3 lectures on the cardiovascular system. That first one, again, was recorded from Thursday, really dove into cardiac anatomy, a lot of duplication, intentionally duplicated from your lab that you had last week, Tuesday, with me. Again, we like to present it twice, 2 different ways to make sure you get it, because the heart in particular is one of the organs where form equals function. Okay. The brain, for example, not so much. Okay. We have the lobes of the brain, and we really can't see that the working parts of the brain produce the output of the brain. But with the heart, the various 4 chambers, the valves, even the construction of the heart itself, the endocardium, all of those things factor into the physical divisions of the heart. They all factor into the physiology and the function of the heart. So that's why the anatomy is even more important when we look at the heart compared to some other organ systems, okay? So that was cardiac anatomy. As a recap, remember we talked about the 3 layers of the structure of the heart, and we talked about how that's going to be a matching question on exam number 2. The epicardium, the myocardium, the thick muscular middle layer, and then the endocardium, that inner smooth lining of the heart. We talked that the heart is a 4-chamber muscular pump, 2 atria on the top, right and left, and 2 ventricles, right and left, underneath them, and that those ventricles are the workhorses of the heart, because they eject blood to the lungs if you're the right ventricle, and out systemically and to the coronary arteries if you're the left ventricle. We talked about the circulatory loops. We talked about the heart feeding itself first, bringing oxygen and nutrients to the muscle cells that are the heart to enable it to continue to work through the coronary circulation. Then we talked about pulmonary circulation, where the heart transports deoxygenated blood from that right ventricle to the lungs for gas exchange, CO2 offload, oxygen onload, and then oxygen-rich blood, specifically oxygen-rich erythrocytes, making their way back to the left atrium and the left side of the heart, ultimately to be ejected by the left ventricle out to the systemic loop, taking oxygen and nutrients and other valuable resources to all the cells, tissues, and organs of the body. Okay, so those were the 3 circulatory loops of the heart. We talked again about the 4 chambers, what divides them, what their structure looks like, how we can differentiate them. We talked about the surface markings of the heart, the various sulci of the heart, and then we concluded the anatomy portion with an introduction and discussion on the 4 valves, the 2 atrioventricular valves, the bicuspid and tricuspid, and the 2 semilunar valves, the pulmonary and the aortic. So that was kind of what you should have a pretty good grasp of by this point, after having it in both lecture and lab. And then today we're going to pick up with physiology, talk a little bit more about heart function, how do things work, and we're going to finish with a math equation that you guys are going to absolutely need to know for the exam and for your lab quiz, okay? That's really important. We're going to talk and define the terms. It's a really easy math equation as long as you know what all 4 elements are. And I'm going to explain those to you toward the end of the lecture today. We're going to build up toward that, and you'll be in great shape for that exam. Next week, or I'm sorry, on Thursday, when we meet again, we'll pick back up with cardiac vessels, and we'll wrap up cardiology, talking about capillaries, arteries, and veins. How are they unique? How are they similar? What specifically do they do at various levels of the body? Okay, and then that'll wrap up 3 lectures on the cardiovascular system, and then we'll finish starting next week with the content for lecture exam number 2 on the respiratory system, which is intentionally designed to be embedded in lecture 2 exam, because the heart and the respiratory system work hand in hand to permit and facilitate gas exchange at the lungs. And then, of course, the cardiovascular system is the transporter of those gases. So we're getting close to, we're about the halfway point with the content toward lecture exam number 2. So let's go ahead and pick up with cardiac physiology where we left off. So let's go ahead and start with the exit point of the heart, specifically that left heart that I talked about, the oxygenated blood leaving the heart, leaving specifically that left ventricle, from the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta and its various branches that branch off of the aorta itself. Okay, I'm going to actually go ahead and lecture from the next slide because we have an illustration of what we're talking about. All right, so here we can see the aorta, and it's this red arch type vessel. The aorta is the largest artery, and we'll be talking more about it on Thursday, but the aorta is the largest artery in the human body, both in diameter and in length. The aorta originates out of the left ventricle. That oxygenated blood getting pumped from the left ventricle emerges again through that aortic valve, which we can't see because, of course, this heart is closed. And then that blood, oxygenated blood, making it out to the body, begins its pathway up the first of 3 segments of the aorta. And it's going to be really important for you guys to know all 3 of the specific segments of the aorta. This very first pathway, fortunately, they're named exactly for what's going on at the 3 segments of the aortic arch, okay? Right where the aortic semilunar valve starts, somewhere like right about in here, if we could see inside this heart, okay? This first segment of the aorta is considered the ascending aorta. Makes perfect sense to me, right? Because the blood is ascending. It's climbing up and out of the heart from the left ventricle. So that's the first of the 3 segments of the aortic arch. The second is the aortic arch itself, and that is this middle section that makes an arch, okay? So again, pretty common sense-ish, pretty easy to remember. All right, in a minute, we're going to talk about these branch vessels that bifurcate off of the aortic arch itself. Okay, so we have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and then, probably no one's surprised, we have the descending aorta. Once it makes the bend downward or inferior, it's then termed the descending aorta. Now, once that descending aorta passes behind the heart itself, we can't see it, but trust that that's what's going on here. It becomes the thoracic aorta, and then it continues downward in an inferior direction throughout the thoracic cavity. And remember, we have that magical divide that divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that's our diaphragm muscle. And when that thoracic aorta reaches and passes through the diaphragm muscle, then it changes names yet again and becomes the abdominal aorta. Okay, so ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, thoracic aorta throughout the thoracic cavity. At the diaphragm, where the cavity names change, it changes from thoracic cavity with the region it's in to the abdominal aorta. through the abdominal region, and then eventually that aorta is going to bifurcate, divide into the iliac arteries in the pelvis and carry oxygenated blood down to the legs. Okay, so that's the pathway of the aorta with its namings. And we're going to be picking up after lecture today. We're going to have lab, of course, and we're going to introduce cardiac vessels. And we're going to talk more about the thoracic and abdominal arteries and veins. And we'll talk about some of the offshoots of the thoracic and abdominal aorta, like the renal arteries and the hepatic arteries, okay? And like I said, the iliac arteries down in the pelvis, just for a few examples. Okay, so let's talk about the branches that branch off of this aortic arch, the middle section of the entire arch itself. Ascending, arch, descending. All right, so we can see them clearly here, right? What we're going to do is talk about this third one that blood would encounter as it's exiting the heart. Let's start over here on this side because the left side is a little bit cleaner to teach first, and then we'll go to the right-hand side. All right, so you're going to hear the term today and Thursday a lot, bifurcation, okay? Bifurcations are where cardiac vessels divide from one into two, okay? They divide and they have branches, okay? Where blood chooses another roadway or pathway and gets into another vessel. That's a bifurcation. So this first bifurcation that we're going to talk about right over here is the last one sequentially for blood leaving the heart via the left ventricle, oxygenated blood. All right, and this is the left subclavian artery, okay? And like the name says, it's a subclavian. It runs on the left-hand side of the patient's body, under the clavicle, under the collarbone, okay? So it's carrying oxygenated blood from the aortic arch out to the left arm, shoulder, and left side of the body, okay? That's the left subclavian. It's the third branch sequentially off of the aortic arch. Okay, the one right in the middle, the second branch that we can see right here is called the left common carotid artery. Okay, and our carotid arteries, there's one on the right and there's one on the left. And what they're going to do is they're going to carry oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood up through our neck and into our head to bring oxygenation and nutrients to our head, our neck, and very importantly, to the brain itself, okay? So the left common carotid artery here, you can see the branch, and bifurcates off of the arch and makes its way straight up the neck into the head. Now, once the common carotids on both the right and the left make their way into the neck area, they're going to bifurcate one more time. And they're going to become the internal, in this case, because we're talking about the left common, it's going to divide into the left internal carotid artery and the left external carotid artery. The right and the right side is going to do the exact same off the right common carotid. In the neck, it's going to bifurcate into internal and external on the right-hand side. The internals, both right and left, are going to carry oxygenated blood to the brain. They're going to supply oxygen needed for the brain to function. The external carotid arteries on the right and the left-hand side are going to supply oxygen and nutrients to all of the special senses, like our ears, our nose, our eyes, as well as our face and head and neck area on the right and left sides. Okay, so external is for the face and neck and all associated sensory organs, and the internal carotids on the right and left shoot straight up to the brain and exclusively bring oxygen and nutrients to the brain itself. Okay? All right, so back to this first one, and this is where there's a little bit of a unique-ism and why I always preview and start with the left. The right-hand side is going to have a right subclavian and a right common carotid. However, as you can see, they start out here, Okay, the right common carotid is right over here. It's going to head into the neck, bifurcate into the internal and external right carotid. And then here's your right subclavian carrying oxygenated blood out to the right arm, shoulder, and side of the body. Okay, the uniqueism, as you can clearly see, is what actually articulates and connects to the aortic arch isn't directly the left, on the left-hand side, the common carotid articulates direct with the aortic arch, as does the left subclavian. Here we have the brachiocephalic trunk, and this is generally, it depends on the person, but generally it's about 2 inches or so long, and it's the actual articulation point. The connection point with the aortic arch is called the brachiocephalic trunk. It runs only a couple of inches, and then bifurcation occurs, and that brachiocephalic trunk splits into the right common carotid and right subclavian. Okay, so a little bit unique in what comes off of the aortic arch on the left side versus the right. All right, so be familiar with those. For the exam, know that the internal carotid arteries, like I mentioned, carry oxygenated blood to the brain. All right, we're going to go ahead and continue one more time to recap the pathway of blood, because this is very important, and that's the reason, believe me, I get tired of talking about the pathway of blood through the heart and through the circulatory loops, as much as you may get tired of hearing it. But I can tell you the reason that I teach it over and over again is because there are multiple questions on the exam and on the lab quiz that are going to depend on you understanding the pathway of blood through the heart and through the pulmonary, coronary, and systemic loops. Okay, so it's really important. That's why I hammer it multiple times. All right, so remember, there's 3 potential return ports for deoxygenated blood making its way back to the right atrium, which by this point we should know is that collecting chamber of the heart for deoxygenated blood coming from the body. We have the superior vena cava, the large vessel from everything above the heart, the head, the neck, the arms and shoulders. All of that deoxygenated blood will make its way back to the right atrium for gas exchange, ultimately via the superior vena cava. And then we have the inferior vena cava, bringing deoxygenated blood from everything inferior or underneath the heart. The abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity, the legs, etc. Okay, and then the third source, don't forget about the third source of deoxygenated blood, and that is the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is a collection of a dumping type vessel where the cardiac veins, that the oxygen rich blood that's delivered to the heart muscle itself, the coronary arteries, have corresponding coronary veins that take deoxygenated blood loaded with CO2 and return them to the right atrium, just like the rest of the body does, superior and inferior vena cava related. Okay, so the coronary sinus is the dumping part for the cardiac vessels, those vessels that feed and bring nutrients and remove waste from the heart itself. Okay, so those are the 3 ways that deoxygenated blood makes it back to the right atrium. Now we have blood in the right atrium. During atrial contraction, the atrioventricular valves open up. Okay, in this case, it's the tricuspid valve on the right-hand side. Blood is ejected down into the right ventricle. It's still oxygen poor. It's still deoxygenated, loaded with carbon dioxide and waste product. When the ventricles then have their turn to contract, the right ventricle contracts, the semilunar valve and the pulmonary valve in particular opens, allowing for that ventricular contraction to eject blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, which then is going to bifurcate into a right and a left pulmonary artery carrying that deoxygenated blood to the right and left lung. for gas exchange. All right, then gas exchange occurs. We're going to learn a lot more about that when we talk about the respiratory system next week. Within the lungs, CO2 is offloaded, oxygen is onloaded. Now those erythrocytes are refreshed, replenished with oxygen, and they're headed back to the heart. They make their way back from the lungs via pulmonary veins. There are 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the right lung, 2 from the left lung. Okay, there's only 2 pulmonary arteries, 1 to the right, 1 to the left. 4 pulmonary veins returning. All 4 pulmonary veins converge and bring that oxygenated blood back to the left atrium. Now we're on the left side of the heart, so we're talking about oxygen-rich, oxygenated blood. All right, left atrium is now full, atrial contraction. In this case, the mitral valve or bicuspid valve opens, allowing for that blood to be ejected from the left atrium down into the left ventricle. Now it's time for the ventricles to contract again. In this case, that aortic valve is going to open, the left ventricle contracts, and the blood is ejected out into that ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, and then throughout the body and all of the branches. Okay? All right. Also, remember, the heart is a stingy organ. It's a selfish organ. It feeds itself first. All right. So we talked about the 3 loops, the pulmonary circuit, where blood is taken to the lungs and returns from the lungs for gas exchange. Okay. We talked about the systemic loop, leaving the heart via the aorta, making the entire loop through the whole entire body and returning to the right atrium. And the coronary arteries we talked about carry oxygen-rich blood from the aorta to nurture and bring oxygen and nutrients to the muscles of the heart itself to keep it functional, and then remove waste, returning it via the coronary veins, as I just mentioned, ultimately dumping into the coronary sinus, which dumps into the right atrium. Okay, this is our first look at kind of a transparent image of the coronary arteries and where they originate. Okay, because the pulmonary trunk here is made transparent, we can see behind it, and we can see that the left main coronary artery branches right off of the ascending aorta immediately after it exits the internal aspect of the heart itself, the left ventricle. Okay, there's also a corresponding right coronary artery that branches off. Okay, now, probably not a surprise at all, the left coronary artery then divides and bifurcates over and over again into multiple hundreds of branches that supply oxygen-rich blood to the left side of the heart, and the right coronary artery does the exact same for the right side of the heart. Okay, now what I want you guys to know for the lab quiz and for the lecture exams is I want you to be, while there are many, many branches of coronary arteries, I want you to be familiar with 4 of them. All right. The first one is this left main coronary artery. Okay. It's this little segment that emanates right off of the ascending aorta. Immediately after the oxygen-rich blood leaves the heart feeds itself. Left main pulls that blood out here and brings it down this far. Now, the left main coronary artery then bifurcates into 2 that you guys need to know. Okay, the first one is called the circumflex artery, and it is going to wind around in this atrioventricular groove right between the left atrium and the left ventricle in the interventricular sulcus that we've talked about, that indentation that separates externally the atrium and the ventricle on the left side. Okay, so that's the circumflex artery, and it runs and winds all the way around to the posterior of the heart. Okay, the second one I want you guys to know about is the other side of this bifurcation with the left main. The circumflex is this branch in the atrioventricular sulcus. But if we continue down the front, the anterior of the heart, is called the anterior interventricular artery. Okay, now in anatomy, that's what this artery is referred to. Okay, so it is absolutely 100% technically correct. Okay, in healthcare, I doubt you will ever hear this called the anterior interventricular artery. In the real world, in healthcare, this is called the left anterior descending, or LAD. Okay, the left anterior descending coronary artery is the healthcare term. A lot of times, as we all know, that there are multiple appropriate names for the same structure. Okay, usually students, when it comes to quiz time, tend to use the anterior interventricular only because it reduces your burden of memorization. Because if you remember back to the recorded lecture on cardiac anatomy, this anterior interventricular artery runs right in the anterior interventricular sulcus. So if you know the name of the indentation, the sulcus that runs right here, it's the exact same name for the sulcus and the artery. Okay, the fourth one that I want you guys to be familiar with and remember is the right coronary artery. Now, the right coronary artery starts off here as the right coronary artery, and it winds all the way around. It remains called the right coronary artery as it runs on the right-hand side through the atrial ventricular sulcus. Okay, so it's just called that. Now, all of these, the right coronary, the left coronary artery, the left anterior descending, and the circumflex all branch off, like I said, multiple times. There are marginal arteries, there are obtuse arteries, there are diagonal arteries, there are hundreds of arteries that bring oxygen-rich blood. I want you guys to be familiar with those four: left main, circumflex, LAD or anterior interventricular artery, and the right coronary artery. Those are the four. If you know those four, you're going to be gold for the quiz and for the lecture exam. All right. Incidentally, it's these coronary arteries that become narrowed as plaque builds up. Okay. And plaque buildup, narrowing of the coronary arteries, is due to cholesterol, largely related to diet. Okay. Certainly, if we eat McDonald's or Burger King 3 meals a day for 10 straight years, we're going to have severely blocked coronary arteries from all that cholesterol building up and narrowing these arteries. Okay. But the number one predictor of blockages in the coronary arteries is genetics. Diet is the second player. Okay. But genetics is the first and by far the strongest player in predicting who's going to have blocked coronary arteries versus who's not. That's why sometimes you can read about someone having a heart attack that's 32 years old and only weighed 95 pounds and ran a marathon the week before. That's just bad genetics. Whereas some people that weigh 400 pounds and can barely walk to the mailbox don't have coronary artery disease. That's good genetics, warding off building up and blocking of the coronary arteries. These blockages are important because these blockages and narrowing of the coronary arteries are what lead to and cause heart attacks. Okay, if this left anterior descending coronary artery becomes 95% blocked down here, we're going to have to go in and put in a stent or do a bypass surgery to create a new vessel that goes around the blockage so that oxygen-rich blood can continue to make its way to all of the distal arteries that feed off of this. Okay, so when we talk about the left main coronary artery, some of you may have heard the term heart attacks called the widowmaker. Okay, the widowmaker heart attack is almost always, as the name suggests, fatal because our left heart is the largest portion of the heart. Okay, and it's also the most important because it's that left ventricle that needs to eject blood out to the whole body, right? So a widowmaker heart attack is when a blockage or a clot occurs here in this left main segment. If the blockage occurs here, you have 100% blockage right here. All of these vessels, ancillary and distal to this left main, are not going to have blood flow anymore. They're not going to carry oxygen to any of this tissue of this entire left side of the heart. And all of it will die almost instantly. And hence, survival rates are extremely slow for widowmaker blockages and heart attacks. Whereas, by contrast, if you had a blockage, for example, over here in this right marginal artery, way down here, only the area of the heart blocked from receiving oxygenated blood, these arteries here, this little segment, would be affected. And that, by comparison, would be what's referred to as a minor heart attack. So a heart attack, its severity is completely related to where the blockage, where the stoppage of blood occurs. All right. So that's arterial blood fed off of the aortic arch, particularly the ascending aortic arch. Okay. Then we have on the venous side, because gas exchange occurs at the myocardial tissue, CO2 is loaded on, oxygen is offloaded. Then this blood needs to make its way back to the right atrium for eventual gas exchange. So we have a number of cardiac veins that in turn bring that blood and ultimately return it to the right atrium. Two of the major players are the great cardiac vein, and the great cardiac vein is just a merger point where a lot of cardiac veins come together and collectively dump blood into that larger great cardiac vein. Okay. And then in turn, as the great cardiac vein winds around to the posterior of the heart, which we can see here shaded to represent that this is the posterior of the heart we're looking at, then we have the coronary sinus back here. We mentioned that before, that the coronary sinus is that intersection. It's that articulation point that physically connects to the right atrium and dumps that deoxygenated blood from the heart back into the right atrium, along with the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay? All right, first of your two quiz questions, and this one's going to take you guys back to the video that I shared with you and to our lab last week. So which is correct about heart valves? Do the atrioventricular valves prevent backflow of blood going into the atria when the ventricles contract? Or do the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves control the flow of blood coming into the heart? Or does the tricuspid valve divide the right ventricle physically from the left ventricle? Which of these three is true? Right, continuing. All right, so we talked about cardiac muscle itself. The next couple of slides are going to be Bio 210 revisited to some extent, but with a little more added on. Remember when we talked about tissue types, we talked about muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Structurally, cardiac muscle performs and appears very much like skeletal muscle. We still have the different bands. We still have the thick and thin filaments. We still have the organelles that lead to depolarization, i.e. contractions, and then repolarization, i.e. relaxation. Okay, but what's different? The two key differences between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are, first of all, the intercalated discs that we've talked about time and again, right? These little hash marks along the sarcomere that allow for the electrical impulses that lead to a contraction, to depolarization, to leapfrog down the line and cause synchronized contractions. Okay, that is the key, most important difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle is synchronized contractions. Remember, think about what the heart does. Our leg muscles can gradually, progressively contract and get smaller to move the bones and to move us. When our ventricles contract, we need them to slam shut with force all at one time to emit the most force, hydrostatic pressure as possible to eject that blood out and move it through the body. So synchronized contractions are the key to successful cardiac muscle function. Okay? Know that for the exam. Unique to the heart, and I mentioned this in the video, is that, again, when we think of our skeletal muscle, right, guys? And if you think about when you exercise, whether you go on a power walk or you go on a jog, for example, okay, your leg muscles in time start to tire, right? They become fatigued. They run out of nutrients. They build up lactic acid and they get fatigued and tired. All right. The heart muscle is very unique in that it never fatigues. It never takes a break. It's been beating 24 hours a day since before you were born until the moment you die. Okay. The heart muscle never, ever, ever gets a break, and yet it never fatigues. So, a key secondary difference of cardiac muscle is that the heart muscle tissue have many mitochondria. Remember back to the organelles of Bio 210 and the mighty mitochondria, the production factory that makes ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy, the gas, the fuel that fuels cellular activities and muscle contractions. It's because of the presence of almost 1/3 of cardiac tissue being mitochondria that there's a surplus of ATP available. So the heart muscle never runs out of fuel or energy and thereby never stops or fatigues. All right, let's move on now to the electrophysiology aspect of cardiology. Okay, electrophysiologists are cardiologists that are a subspecialty that focus on heart rate and heart rhythm. Okay, the electrical conduction system, pacemaking of the heart. Okay, and the heart originates an electrical impulse. If you remember again back to Bio 210, all muscular contractions are a result of an electrical impulse, right? Depolarization causes muscles to contract. Repolarization causes muscles to relax and rearm themselves and prepare themselves to contract again. The heart is no different. It relies on electrical impulses. Okay, so when we talk about the electrical conduction system of the heart, it all starts and originates at our brainstem, okay, and specifically to the medulla oblongata, that very first section of the brainstem. Remember back to Bio 210, when the spinal cord emerges through the foramen magnum at the base of the skull, it changes its name from the spinal cord into the brainstem, and that very first segment is the medulla oblongata. Okay, and it's that medulla oblongata that is receiving sensory information, receptors from all over the body, sending signals, telling the medulla what to in turn signal to the heart to do, speed up or slow down, for example. Okay, so back to my analogy or example of running. Okay, if I am standing at the mouth of my driveway and I start off on my run, sensors, receptors in my leg muscles, as well as other places, but sensors are going to say, hey, we're underway, we're doing something different here. There's demand on the leg muscles, and they're going to send a signal to the medulla of the brainstem to in turn signal the heart that we better speed up because we're going to need more blood and more oxygen. We're working now. Okay? So that's where it all emanates. And specifically from the medulla, the signal that is sent to the heart is part of, and this will again go back to Bio 210, it's sent via the autonomic portion of the nervous system. Remember, the autonomic nervous system is the automatic nervous system. It's the one that is unconsciously controlled. We don't think about making our heart beat, right? So the autonomic nervous system, the medulla oblongata, and the autonomic nervous system are the initial conduction of the electrical signal headed toward the heart to either speed the heart rate up or slow the heart rate down, depending on the circumstances and what we need to maintain homeostasis. Now, when that autonomic nervous system, those nerves, get to the first pacemaker, the first node, there are two pacemakers, two nodes that conduct electrical impulses in the heart. The first of which is the major player. This is the sinoatrial or SA node. Okay, it's called the sinoatrial because it's here in the right atrium is where it exists, and it's up here at the very top of the atrium. In Latin, sino means top. Okay, so it's named appropriately. It's in the top of the atrium, the sinoatrium. Okay, all right, so the sinoatrial node, this is also referred to as our body's natural pacemaker. This is the initial point of all pacemaking or heart rhythm activity, heartbeat rate related activity, speeding up, slowing down, maintaining a healthy rhythm. Okay, so the sinoatrial node, I'm going to use the analogy when I talk about electrical impulses through the heart of the internet in your home. Okay, it's the easiest way I think to understand it because there's two different modes of conduction that occur and signals that are sent. The sinoatrial node, as I said, receives a direct neural stimuli from the autonomic nervous system coming from the brainstem, specifically the medulla. All right. Now, the sinoatrial node will then send a wireless type signal, okay, a non-hardwired signal transmission to both the left atrium and to the right atrium, causing those atria on both sides to depolarize and contract, squeezing the atria and ejecting blood down into the ventricles. Okay, so that's the first thing the SA node does when it comes to heartbeat and heart rate regulation. Now, within milliseconds of sending that Wi-Fi like signal to both of the atria, leading to contractions, a millisecond delay, it will send a second Wi-Fi like signal, a non-physically connected signal, to the other node, which is called the atrioventricular node, the AV node, which is down here, appropriately named, also in the right atrium. Both electrophysiology nodes are in the right atrium. The AV node is located right here where the right atrium meets the right ventricle. Okay, so hence called the atrioventricular node. So the initial signal is a non-wired impulse that is sent, an electrical impulse sent to the left and right atrium, leading to atrial contraction. Millisecond delay, secondary non-hardwired electrical impulse sent to the atrioventricular node. Now from here, all of the signals are going to be hardwired. And the reason for that physiologically makes sense, okay? We don't need a hardwired signal. We can have an impulse, an electrical impulse type signal is strong enough from the SA node to cause both of the atria, right and left, to contract. Because remember, the atrial walls are extremely thin. They don't require a lot of force. So because the muscle wall is extremely thin and they don't need a lot of force, it only takes a slight electrical signal to get them to depolarize and contract. So that's why this impulse signal, my analogy is Wi-Fi, are sufficient to trigger contractions of the atria. However, as you guys know from my previous lecture, these ventricles are much more massive and muscular. They require a significantly higher threshold of electrical stimuli, leading to depolarization and contraction. So now we're hardwired from here on because we need more electrical activity to cause a contraction. All right, so the impulse is now at the atrioventricular node. Now we're moving toward a ventricular connection. And from the AV node, the signal is going to travel down this atrioventricular bundle, is this first portion of the hardwire, if you will. It's a nerve, of course, in reality. Also sometimes referred to as the bundle of His, H-I-S. All right, that bundle of His, or atrioventricular bundle, is going to branch. It's going to bifurcate. The nerve's going to bifurcate in this case into bundle branches. Okay, so we're going to have a left bundle branch carrying the electrical signal toward the left ventricle, and we're going to have a right bundle branch carrying the electrical impulses down the interventricular septum to the right ventricle. When those electrical impulses get as far as the apex of the heart, we can see that they're going to bend and work their way back up around the outer aspects of each of the respective ventricles. Okay. At this point, once they make the bend and start moving up the outer wall of the right and the left ventricle, they're called Purkinje fibers. Okay. So we have the SA node, we have the atrioventricular node, we have the atrioventricular bundle or bundle of His. It bifurcates into bundle branches, left bundle branch, right bundle branch. At the apex, where they make the turn and start the electrical impulse back up the outer walls of the ventricles, now they're called Purkinje fibers. Okay? And all of these are to create electrical depolarization leading to ventricular contraction. And we're going to see this again in lab later today. All right, so know that autonomic nervous system, I mentioned it several times, it originates from the medulla, but I mentioned previously that the medulla can send signals to either speed the heart up, our heart rate up, if we're starting to exercise, or it may send signals via the autonomic nervous system to slow the heart down if we've stopped our run and now we're in cool down mode, as an example. Okay, back to Bio 210. Remember that the autonomic nervous system is subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system, something that ramps up or speeds up activity. So that's going to be the division of the autonomic nervous system that's going to increase our heart rate. Or the second division of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic division, and that slows things or calms things down. That's the division that would decrease our heart rate. All right, depolarization, repolarization, Bio 210, revisited. Muscular contractions of cardiac muscle occur when it comes to depolarization and repolarization in the exact same fashion as skeletal muscle does. If you remember, we had the sodium-potassium pumps of muscle tissue that exchange sodium and potassium inside and outside of the muscle cell itself, leading to an electrical charge variance, leading to depolarization. When that occurs, the muscle contracts. Calcium, of course, is released, and then the muscle contracts. Then the sodium and potassium move back through the sodium potassium pumps and balance is restored. And that's called repolarization, causing the muscle to relax. Same exact process occurs with cardiac muscle as does with skeletal muscle that we talked about in much more depth over in Bio 210. All right, electrocardiography in EKG or ECG, okay? All of you have probably seen or perhaps even had an EKG at some point in your lifetime. If you haven't had one, you've certainly seen one on television, right? And I'm going to talk about the EKG while we're looking at the illustration of an EKG test. An EKG, an electrocardiogram, is a measure of the electrical activity, the depolarization and repolarization of the atria and the ventricles of the heart. And it's really measuring and analyzing the different electrical nodes and the entire electrical conduction system for any potential flaws or defects that might be occurring, okay, called arrhythmias. Okay, here we can see a standard EKG is a 12 lead EKG. Each lead are each of these wires attached with a diode here at various strategic points on the patient's body to measure the flow of electrical activity across different angles of the heart. Okay, and then in turn, while the EKG is acquiring its data, all the electrical depolarization, repolarization that's occurring throughout a heart cycle, it then is recording the EKG data on a strip. Okay, and nowadays it's more computerized. It used to be paper-based, but I know all of you have seen this type of a printout of what an EKG looks like. Again, if for no other reason, on television, we see these on drama shows, right? All right, so let's talk for a minute about the EKG and what this EKG printout or reading means. We're not going to get into a lot of depth on this. We're going to double this up very briefly today over in lab. We're going to talk about this again, and specifically what you need to know over after the lab quiz related to an EKG strip. And we're going to see even a short 3-minute video on EKG strips in lab, okay? So you're going to get a couple of touches on EKGs today, all right? But so believe me, you can get very, very into the weeds on EKGs. I had to take an entire year of a course on EKGs. You can analyze and slice and dice every single millisecond along all of these segments and what's going on if you really get particular. For Bio 211, I just want you to know what the major blips are, the major tracings are for an EKG, okay? All right, so the first thing on the EKG strip that we're going to talk about is what's called the P wave, okay? And this P wave here, as it says, is the depolarization, or in other words, the contraction of the atria, the right and left atria. So this little blip, when we see this flat line here, no electrical activity. We all know that from television drama science, right? When someone dies, they flatline, and all we see is the EKG strip buzzing, and it's just this flat line. That means there's no electrical activity. The heart is not beating. That's what the flat line represents on a TV drama when someone dies, okay? But when we have this little inflection, we've had some electrical activity of the heart. In this case, this P wave is representing and showing the atria, both right and left, depolarizing or contracted. That's what the P wave is. All right, next, as we move forward in time, and these are milliseconds. In milliseconds, the next thing that's going to occur sequentially, electrically, is what we call the QRS complex, okay? This QRS complex is the depolarization or the contractions of the ventricles, right and left, okay? Now, the first thing that should stand out and be very, very obvious is that the P wave only has a tiny little indentation here of electrical activity, whereas the QRS complex has a massive spike by comparison. And that is, again, fairly intuitive as to why. It only takes, as I mentioned previously, a tiny bit of electrical activity to depolarize and contract the atria. It takes a massive electrical impulse to depolarize and contract the ventricles. That's why the QRS complex is so much more prominent than the P wave is. Okay, now at the same time as we're seeing on this printout, on the trace out of the strip, the QRS complex, in the background, we can't see it because it's lost, but the atria are repolarizing right here at the same time, because we know how the heart beats, right? While the atria contract, the ventricles relax. And then while the ventricles contract, the atria relax, right? So repolarization of the atria is occurring, but it's obscured because of this massive electrical influx shown by ventricular depolarization contraction. So it's lost. We can't ascertain or measure that. All right, and then the third part that I want you guys to know about then is the repolarization that we couldn't see for the atria, but for the ventricles, it's called the T wave. So with the P wave, contraction of the atria, QRS, contraction of the ventricles, and then the T wave is the repolarization or relaxation of the ventricles. Okay, that one shows up. Okay, so those are the major waves that form an EKG tracing or strip. All right, let's talk about systole and diastole. And we've talked about these before. You guys have heard these terms, systolic and diastolic, certainly related to blood pressure, if for no other reason. All right, first of all, I'm going to use the word technically. Technically, there is atrial systole and ventricular systole, and there's atrial diastole, and there's ventricular diastole. Systole means contracting, diastole means relaxed, okay? So while the atria contract, they're in atrial systole. So then that means the ventricles would have to be in ventricular diastole. Then the ventricles contract and go into ventricular systole, and the atria go into relax and go into atrial diastole. Okay? So diastole is when they're relaxed and the chambers are open and filling or receiving vessels. And systole is when they're contracting and ejecting blood from the given chamber. Okay? So that's technically both the atria and the ventricles do have systole and diastole. 99.9% of the time, unless you're in a cardiology specialty, you're not going to ever talk about atrial systole or atrial diastole. It's highly specific. Okay. Usually, when we hear the terms in healthcare about systole and diastole or systolic and diastolic, we're talking about the heart as a whole. And remember, I've told you multiple times now that the ventricles are the workhorse of the heart. So ventricular systole is what we call systole, and ventricular diastole, what the ventricles are doing, is what we typically refer to as systole or diastole. Okay? And that applies specifically to blood pressure. Okay? We'll talk more about blood pressure in lab, but our blood pressure is nothing more than the hydrostatic pressure, the blood volume, being forced against receptors that are buried in the artery walls. Okay, that's how blood pressure is acquired. Okay, it's the pressure of the blood pushing outward on the artery walls. That's what blood pressure is. So when the ventricles contract and go into ventricular systole or just systole, okay, the pressure is going to be higher, right? Because those large ventricles have just contracted. That pressure is at its peak, it's at its highest. So that if we're talking about blood pressure and your blood pressure is 140/80, that would be the 140 reading, okay? That's the systolic blood pressure, your top number, the higher number. Then the ventricles relax, go into diastole, letting off the pressure. Hydrostatic pressure drops. And then, of course, with it, the pressure on the arterial walls will drop and reduce. And that's where the 80 number would come, your diastolic blood pressure. Okay? So that's where diastole and systole come in. All right, so the cardiac cycle is just that blood flow through the heart during one complete heartbeat. Again, we know all about how this works. We've talked about all of this before. We know heart chambers fill when they're relaxed in diastole. They empty when they contract. Systole, we know the atria can contract sequentially, then the ventricles. We know that the valves influence all of that. Okay, this is all recap. But what I do want to talk about is the ventricular filling, because this is leading us to our math problem, our word problem that you guys are going to have to be able to understand and recreate when it comes time for the exam. All right, again, it's really easy. The math part is easy if you know what the terms are. Okay, first of all, we know that when the atria contract, this first part and first exam question is that blood, when the atria contract, flow through the atrioventricular valves, bicuspid and tricuspid, and are ejected from the atria inferiorly through the AV valves into the ventricles, right? That's a real easy one. You guys should know that one by now. Okay, now, that volume of blood, though, that was just ejected from the atria on either side. Let's just talk about the left side for simplicity's sake, okay? So from the left atrium, when it contracts and that blood is ejected through the mitral valve down into the left ventricle, and when all that blood, when the left atrium is done contracting, right before the left ventricle starts its contraction, there is a volume of blood that can be measured in there, especially by Doppler imaging, echocardiogram can image and detect the volume in milliliters of blood that was passed from the atrium down into that left ventricle. That volume is called end diastolic volume. And this is the first term that you definitely need to know to work out the math for your exam. The end diastolic blood is the amount of blood in each ventricle right before, at the end of the ventricular diastole, right before the ventricle contracts. Okay, so it's the maximum amount of blood passed from the atria into the ventricle. Okay, end diastolic volume. First term that's really important. All of these are leading to measuring and quantifying cardiovascular health. That's what this is all about, looking for heart function. How is the heart and the vascular system performing? All right, then the ventricles contract, right? And blood is ejected. We know that. All right, after the ventricles, remember, end diastolic volume was the total volume of blood right before the ventricle contracted. Okay, let's call it 50 milliliters of blood. Now the ventricle is going to contract, right? And it's going to eject blood, left ventricle into the aorta, all right? The heart, like everything else in the body, is not 100% efficient. I've said this many times. You're going to hear it many more throughout the course. We wish it was, but it's not. So there's going to be some residual volume of blood, some leftover blood, some blood that doesn't get ejected from the heart when the ventricle contracts. Okay? That leftover blood, the amount that remains in the ventricle after the ventricle contracts, is then called the end systolic volume. Both of those terms make sense. If you're talking about measurement of blood in the ventricle, and diastolic is right before when diastole of the ventricle ended, the maximum amount of blood right before the contraction occurs, and then end systolic volume is right after systole, right after the ventricle contracted, the amount of blood that remains in the ventricle. Okay? Now, the reason that's important, let's talk for 1 minute about heartbeat sounds. And I hate that this slide is right here, but we're going to come back to what we were talking about. Know for the exam, we've talked about this previously, that the heartbeat, when we're listening with a stethoscope, the lub-dub type sound is the closing of valves. The first lub sound are the atrioventricular valves slamming shut. And then the dub sound, the second part of a heartbeat, is the sound of those semilunar valves closing. Okay, and there's a slight millisecond pause in between. Just know that the lub-dub sound is related to heart valves. I hate that Pearson put those slides in that order. I don't know why they did this right in the middle, but nonetheless, back to what we were talking about, quantifying heart function. We had end diastolic volume, the maximum amount of blood. What they're using is 350 milliliters of blood in the left ventricle, right after the atria got done contracting. That is the end diastolic volume, right when the left ventricle got done relaxing, diastole. All right, then the contraction occurs and the blood is ejected from the left ventricle. And we're going to measure again the blood that remains in the left ventricle. That again is called end systolic volume. For their analogy, 147 milliliters remained in the left ventricle. All right, from that, we can subtract the two and determine how much blood was ejected from the ventricle. In this case, 350 is what we started with. 147 milliliters remained after the ventricle contracted. So therefore, we know that 203 milliliters were in fact ejected out of the left ventricle. The reason we need this formula for this math problem is because we can't quantify the amount of blood that was ejected from the heart because it's immediately and instantly moving all throughout the body. So we can't measure it accurately, but we can with imaging, with sonography, we can acquire the volumes of blood at the end of ventricular diastole and at the end of ventricular systole. And if we use this simple equation, we can determine then how much in fact was ejected. And how much was ejected is cardiovascular health, right? Because if you have only a third of your blood ejected, you're going to have decreased oxygen making it out to the body, and the patient is going to be fainting and be exhausted, have shortness of breath, all the things that come from deficient oxygen. Okay, so that's just one example of one thing that can come from deficient blood being ejected. All right, so that term of what is actually ejected from the ventricle is called stroke volume. Stroke volume, as it says, is the volume of blood ejected from a ventricle in one heartbeat. Okay, and we derive stroke volume because we can't acquire it via imaging. We derive it from end diastolic volume, subtract end systolic volume, what remains, and we can come up with stroke volume. Now, What we're searching for then with stroke volume is the holy grail of cardiology and cardiac function, and that is cardiac output. And this is a real easy mathematical equation that builds off of these three terms, and this is the last one. All right, this is cardiac output. All we do is take that stroke volume, the amount of blood ejected in one heartbeat, and we multiply it by our heart rate, our number of beats per minute. And then that will give us the amount of blood that was ejected from that ventricle in 1 minute's time. The reason that's important is you need a larger sample size to definitively know what's going on with a patient's heart than just one beat. That's why we can't just say, oh, the stroke volume was 203, so they're healthy. Our heart and its rhythms, we have subtle variances. Sometimes our heart speeds up, sometimes our heart skips a beat, sometimes our heart slows down. So we want the aggregate, a large data set that is acquired over the course of an entire minute to give us a more accurate representation of the heart's function. It'd be just like if I took this section, these two sections, and I only looked at one of your exam scores, and I said the average exam score in this course is 94 because that's what the one person got. Well, we all know that's not accurate. There are 50 some other people in the class. But if we average all of your data together, then we have an accurate picture of what your exam scores are. That's why we take stroke volume and then we add in 60 seconds worth of heartbeats to derive accurate cardiovascular health related to cardiac output. This is the holy grail, the key measurement in cardiology for assessing heart health and heart function. So know for the exam that blood flow to the entire cardiovascular system is related, proportional to cardiac output. How much blood and oxygen gets out of the heart in a minute's time is the determinant of how much oxygen is making it out on a regular basis. All right, and then we have some multiple factors, or many more than these, that can influence cardiac output and heart health, cardiovascular wellness. Okay, these are just some exercise. Okay, if we start to exercise, our muscles, if we start to run, our muscles of our arms, the arteries will start to constrict, and they'll push that blood from our arms in to our core, to our vital organs, and to the muscles of our legs where the activity is taking place. Redirect, reprioritizes that blood flow, okay, to bring additional oxygen and nutrients to the leg muscles, which are working when we run, okay? That redirection and moving blood into the core will increase the amount of blood coming back to the right atrium and to the heart. And if we increase the amount of blood while we're exercising, we're going to increase our stroke volume, the amount that's ejected with every beat. We know then that if we increase stroke volume, we're going to increase cardiac output. So when a patient exercises during a stress test, we would expect to see cardiac output increase as well. Okay, things like our hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, during that fight or flight panic response, that creates a faster heart rate and increases the activity, the muscle cells of the heart itself to contract with more force, increasing both heart rate and stroke volume, increasing cardiac output. If we have changes in our blood pressure, for example, it's going to influence our cardiac output. And specifically, our heart rate, if our sympathetic nervous system increases activity, it's going to increase our heart rate, which will increase cardiac output, like when we start to exercise. And then if the other division of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic system is activated and we slow our heart rate down. In turn, that's going to decrease cardiac output. Okay. So again, just some examples of variables. This, by the way, guys, is not a matching question. There are only 3 matching questions on exam number 2. There's only one on the cardiovascular system, and that's that one that I showed you guys, talked about in my recorded lecture about the layers of the heart wall. Okay, the other 2 we'll be talking about when we get to the respiratory system. This one looks like it would be, but it's not. All right, and the last quiz question for today for extra credit, there's only 2 of them. What's correct about blood flow? Is blood flow highest where there's the most resistance? Is blood flow through the entire cardiovascular system related to cardiac output? Or is blood flow measured in millimeters of mercury? Remember, I'm talking about blood flow, not blood pressure. All right? You can get that answer for me. All right. So we're going to take our break. That's it for lecture on cardiovascular physiology. First of all, are there any questions? Good. All right, it's 3:36. Send me your emails during the break to get your extra credit point and be marked here for attendance. Let's reconvene at 3:50, 350, and we'll pick up with lab today. We're going to do cardiac vessels in lab, and this will be the last of your content before lab quiz number 2. So I'll get you all prepared and show you what you need to know. See you back here at 3:50. Don't forget, send me that extra credit email in order to be marked present and get your extra credit point toward exam number 2. See you guys in